Yes, they are.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me again this year to this wonderful conference, and also Sarah for your introduction. So coming originally from an energy systems analysis perspective, in fact, I have addressed much of my research in the past years on sort of looking above and beyond and left and right to the energy system, just because in Germany, we realized that we have this immense knowledge of sort of the techno-economic optimized energy system. So we know fairly well what the energy system should or could optimally look like, but we're also seeing a lot of social dynamics that prevent that we're actually getting where we want to get. And then we also had this whole debate about biofuels in the 2000s, when we realized that sort of the analyses of indirect land use change, of the conflict between food versus fuel played a tremendous role, and that some technologies in Germany just aren't an option. So if we consider carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and use in Germany currently simply isn't an option because it's very much unaccepted by the German public. And so, in fact, we did do a nexus analysis between the water, land, and energy nexus a few months ago that we just published, where we looked at sort of the future impacts on land and water resources of the German energy system in the future. And we saw that if we do want to meet the very ambitious German energy targets, we do need a lot of imports according to the model biomass imports. So we're creating, again, negative or land use demands in other countries. And so this brought me to the topic that I'm talking about today, namely the bioeconomy as sort of the new leitmotif that's being promoted in Germany. Just a second. So what we currently have in Germany is we have two main national policies that drive a tremendous and very rapid structural change process. So it's the bioeconomy strategy on the one hand, that's sort of promoting the use of biological resources to replace fossil resources. And at the same time, we have the decision to phase out coal power. And these two policies drive in the structural change process that I want to introduce today. And this was brought about in 2016 when the Climate Action Plan of the German government proposed the implementation of a commission, the so-called Coal Commission, the Commission for Growth, Structural Change and Regional Development. And their objective was to prepare the phase out of coal power, but at the same time to develop policy instruments to guide the structural change process. And in 2019, they published their final report. And this has really driven up this structural change process that's funded by over 40 billion euros. And the Rhenish lignite mining, as the case study region, is actually Europe's largest connected lignite mine area. So the sustainable bioeconomy, the circular bioeconomy, is promoted as the leitmotif. So the area should become a European, or wants to become a European model region for a sustainable bioeconomy. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this slide, just to give you an impression of the various policy frameworks. I just mentioned the Coal Commission with the proposal to phase out coal power and lignite mining. Then in 2020, we had the decision of the law for the improvement of regional economic structures that sort of sets the funding framework for the structural change process. Then we also had the coal phase out law decided last year that defines the path for the coal phase out until 2038. So that's when the last coal power plant is supposed to go off grid. And at the same time, we have the European Green Deal that provides additional funding for the structural change process. And then just this year, we also had the German climate protection law that sets new and even more ambitious climate and CO2 reduction targets. So all of these policies set off this tremendous societal and infrastructural transformation process. And we've seen in the past that usually such transformations sort of happen incrementally and are rather slow. But with the funding and the regulation, we have sort of path dependencies and lock-in infrastructures broken up, and sort of a very rapid change that gives us huge opportunities, but also a lot of challenges and risks. And on the right side, you actually see the three large mines that are in the Rhenish lignite mining region. And Jülich is sort of right in the central little point between there. So actually our research center and the University of Aachen, the city of Aachen, is right next to it. So we're essentially right in the middle of this region. And just to give you an impression, This is a picture of the one of the coal mines, the medium-sized one, and you can see how close the mines actually move to the communities. We have a lot of people, a lot of villages that had to be relocated, and this also explains why there's a very strong social involvement with this whole structural change process. So coal mining has been for a long time one of the main sources of income and employment in the regions, and at the same time, we have a very uncertain sort of change process ahead of the region now. And so there's very strong social opinion and engagement of a huge variety of stakeholders in this process. So going back and explaining just a little bit about the understanding of the bioeconomy. So the idea is to have sort of bio-based value chains, to have biological resources replace fossil resources. And on the left side, just an image of what we had in the past, so the food versus fuel debate. Using sort of edible biological resources is not an option. So we're only talking about sort of circular uses of non-edible food or food waste, essentially from other industrial processes. But what we're seeing is that not only the energy system has a certain demand for biological resources, but we also have this whole set of new products that are emerging. So everyone is aware, obviously, of bioplastics, but in the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, there are huge development currently of new processes for new products, replacing fossil resources by these biological feedstocks. And so we have increasing pressure on sort of these resources. And there's quite a risk that a similar sort of problem occurs in Germany now, or in Europe, as it's a general European trend that was actually also mentioned by Michelle Voss in her keynote when she focused more on minerals. But the fact that sort of the policy process is driving, and often sort of in silos develop, is driving this rapid sort of change process that may create secondary challenges that are not sufficiently considered as the process is moving on right now. So as I just mentioned, we have major transformation of existing resource systems, the ones that are sort of being phased out now, and the new resource and networks and value chains that are emerging. And we have this tremendous array of stakeholders involved, from the public to industry actors to policymakers in different sectors. And they're all sort of involved in this decision-making process. But we also know quite a bit of things already from the German Energiewende that we analyzed as a sort of a societal transformation process in which this is embedded. So as I mentioned, we know that the availability of technological solutions is a necessary but not a sufficient precondition. We know that the techno-economically optimal solutions are in practice rarely ever realized. We also know that changing stakeholder discourses and power constellations, new policy coalitions have a tremendous influence on the process. And we also know that stakeholders don't act objectively at all times, but that they often act upon their subjective perceptions and interests. And all of these things sort of influence where we're actually moving with the transformation. And so the actual implementation process that's implemented in Germany is in fact one that's strongly participative. So we have sort of the EU funding, the federal funding, but the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia is the one actually sort of responsible for the implementation. And they are working closely with the future agency, Rhenish Lignite mining region, which is sort of the organization that organizes the implementation process. And they're organized along sort of 6 topical hubs. So one of them is space, landscape, and infrastructure. One is infrastructure and mobility, innovation and education. And then we have 2 that are strong relevance. And one is the one that's energy and industry. And we have a second one that's agribusiness and resources. And this is actually, I think, one of the challenges already, that these 2 topics, although they're so strongly interlinked, are actually dealt with in sort of 2 different knowledge and participation hubs. And I wanted to today talk and look at sort of the stakeholders involved and how they influence the process. So from a conceptual background, we use the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework by Elinor Ostrom, simply because it allows bringing together sort of the exogenous variables such as resource availabilities, but also sort of cultures and traditions in a region, and the rules for the implementation, and then the action arenas, sort of the places where negotiations are taking place, decisions are being made that we can analyze. And again, for the talk, I would like to focus on sort of the interplay of the rules of the process and how it sort of influences or is influenced by the participants. So the success of the transformation process is strongly sort of dependent on the interplay between the actual rules in use, so how are decisions made, and the integration of the stakeholders. And what we find is that there are usually gaps between sort of the rules in form, so the theoretical sort of foundation of how the process should be designed, and how it is actually implemented, and the same between sort of the stakeholder visions, expectations, and perspectives, and which ones and how are actually integrated and considered in the process. So we did a number of analyses, of stakeholder analyses that I want to introduce, so at least the main results in the coming slides. So we began to look at sort of the bioeconomy experts, the scientists that directly sort of do research on the bioeconomy. And so we used the 2019 International Bioeconomy Symposium to conduct an expert survey among over 100 participants of the symposium. And we asked them what topics they associate with the bioeconomy. And as you see on the right side, so everyone agreed that it deals with materials from renewable resources. Almost everyone considers that bioenergy and biofuels are an important part of the bioeconomy. And there are a number of additional aspects, but then you also see that, for example, aspects such as regional sustainable consumption receive sort of much lower agreement, or is less, to a lesser degree, associated with the bioeconomy. So what this showed us is that actually by the bioeconomy scientists, the bioeconomy is sort of this complex, all-encompassing term that strongly focuses on utilizing sort of the resource base, but that to a lesser degree, aspects of sustainable consumption or other ecological aspects are seen as the focus of the bioeconomy. So in the next step, we asked the experts regarding their expectations on environmental implications. And here you can see that really the vast majority, over 90% of the respondents, said that they believe that the bioeconomy have a strongly positive effect on CO2 emissions and on the reduction of plastic waste, for example. But you also see that there's a more skeptical view on sort of biodiversity loss in natural areas. So they believe that the bioeconomy may actually aggravate problems in this context. So we have high expectations for environmental performance, but more cautious expectations regarding natural areas and biodiversity, for example. And then in the next step, we also asked the scientists on their expectations on economic implications. And here we see, again, a very strongly positive association, expecting it'll be a new research field, a new role model for an economic system, new jobs, but slightly more skepticism as to whether it can actually contribute economically on sort of energy-related topics. So energy security, and increasing the energy independence were the two aspects that were asked. So we have even higher expectations for economic performance, but cautious estimations regarding the energy-related topics. And then in the next step, we decided that we want to see how the media portrays the bioeconomy, because obviously that's one of the main sort of sources of information for the general public. So what we did, we searched the LexisNexis database for all newspaper articles in all of Germany that were published between 2010 and 2019, so the year when the first bioeconomy strategy was published, and the publication of the Kohl Commission's final report. And we identified almost 800 newspaper articles. Not so surprising that the number of articles per year increased over the period. But what we found is that generally the coverage of the bioeconomy is rather superficial and brief. And that the topics that are covered mainly deal with questions of sort of biotechnology development, research, and industrial production. So what we then did, we looked for a concept to sort of for a more in-depth analysis of the newspaper articles. And we found a paper by Bugge et al. 2016, and they identified sort of three main visions or perspectives of the bioeconomy. So one is the biotechnology perspective that looks at the development of new processes for the use of biological resources, and the technology development perspective. Then the second vision being the bioresource vision, that looks at sort of the availability and production of biological resources. And then the third one, the bioecology, that covers topics of sustainable consumption, nature protection, and sort of the more ecology-oriented topics. And what we see that the vast majority, over 80%, between 80 and 90% of the articles focus on the biotechnology vision. Roughly half of the articles had some consideration of the bioresource perspective, but only between 10 or at maximum little over 20% of the articles actually explicitly address sort of the sustainability ecology perspective of the bioeconomy and the use of biological resources. So two of the things that were also noticeable is that the articles often look at sort of existing economic and industrial structures and see how sort of new technologies can improve these industrial structures and economic processes, and that social and ecological concerns are often cited as sort of a criticism of the prevalent understanding of the bioeconomy. Then we also wanted to look at, and this is sort of a more obvious outcome from the previous slide, we looked at which visions are sort of dealt with in combination. And so we see that mostly it is sort of the biotechnology perspective that refers to the bioresource, so the availability of the resources for a specific new chemical process. But the fact that sort of the bioresource perspective, so the available of biological resources, together with a bioecology perspective, is rarely ever mentioned or discussed really in only very few of the newspaper articles. So we found that, again, we have the strong support of the biotechnology vision, often, as it's, for example, in context sort of the global challenges, but the ecological aspects are mostly only discussed in the form of sort of a broader discussion when many of the visions or sort of the concept is introduced, or as a critique of the other two visions and perspectives on the bioeconomy. Then we wanted to see what the citizens, the German public, actually really thinks of the bioeconomy. So we conducted a representative survey among the German publication. And in the first step, we wanted to know how known the concept even is to the publication. So in the first question, we asked them to spontaneously indicate their interpretation of the term bioeconomy. And what's striking is that almost 50%, so almost essentially half of the German population, has no association or understanding of the term bioeconomy. And then another 20% said that they believe it has something to do with an ecological economy or with biomass, agriculture, or energy. And there are only sort of very few people who had more specific assumptions of what the bioeconomy actually is. So we found that there's this lack of awareness that we had assumed there would be about the concept. And there's also one thing that's sort of maybe sort of typical in Germany, namely the fact that bioeconomy has the word bio in it. And in the German language, bio actually is sort of the word for organic. So organic farming in Germany is biofarming and organic food is biofood. So that sort of drives this assumption that there's some ecological perspective to it. But overall, we also found that there's generally a vast support of the concept. Then again, we asked the citizens roughly the same questions we asked the experts. So we asked the citizens to estimate what they believe the impact of the bioeconomy will be on environmental implications. And here we see that the public is sort of less skeptical when it comes to questions of the bioeconomy's contribution to CO2 emissions and through the reduction of plastic waste. But in contrast to the experts, they actually have a higher expectation that the bioeconomy can contribute to reducing biodiversity loss and to protecting natural areas and natural landscapes. So we have higher expectations for environmental performance, but less optimistic about the other aspects such as emission reductions or plastic waste. Similarly, we also asked the public what they believe regarding economic implications. And here we also see a more skeptical perspective. So although still a majority of the public believes that the bioeconomy may have sort of positive economic impacts, especially as sort of a new role model for a new economic system, an alternative to lignite mining in the lignite mining regions, for example, the expectations are lower than the experts assume. So overall, still positive, but less optimistic expectations. And then the last thing we did is we actually wanted to understand how these sort of different stakeholder perspectives that we had identified are actually portrayed in scientific publications. So we called this the perspective we thought we knew. We looked at all of the available research on bioeconomy perceptions. We used the Scopus and Science Direct database and searched for all articles that address the topic of bioeconomy, and identified over 108 articles. And one of the interesting things that we see is that the vast majority of these articles address Europe of a case study, or to a much lesser extent, but to some degree, America. Very few publications that address Asia or Africa, but this may also be the fact that it's just not labeled sort of bioeconomy as a term in those regions. So we haven't looked into this enough, but this is something that we found. And on the top left, the green bars, you see that sort of what we call the golden triangle of experts is mostly portrayed in the and considered in the scientific publications. So again, the perspectives of political actors, of industry and research and scientists, and to a lesser degree, farmers, NGOs, or the general public. And on the right side, just you see that most of the studies have a national focus, and then the other 6 have either an international or a regional focus, or sort of a generic focus, focusing on the bioeconomy as a general concept with no sort of geographical scope. So the things we found in these articles, in these publications, were that NGOs are sort of mostly asked about governance aspects, and that the studies that focus on the public or citizens usually focus on sort of consumption decisions, and obviously farmers are most often analyzed with respect to their biomass production studies, production of the biological resources. And then again, what we did is we looked in how far the 3 visions that we used for the other analyses are actually also considered in the different stakeholder groups in these publications. And what we see here is, again, that the experts, the political actors, industry, and research actors almost exclusively focus on sort of the biotechnology perspective, and to some degree on the availability of biological resources. But again, the bioecology perspective, so the sustainability perspective, is rarely ever discussed in these publications. And this is different for those publications that address sort of citizens and consumers, or farmers, and to some degree when sort of researchers are analyzed as stakeholders. So again, we have a relatively even share between the 2 dominant visions, resource and technology. And we were a little surprised that the technology vision is also so dominant and strong among the public. But the reason for this is mainly that these studies are then consumer studies that, for example, analyze the acceptance of a certain technology or product. And last but not least, we looked at the actual implementation of the process in the region. And this is quite interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, it's the future agency that's responsible for implementing the transformation, and it's a participatory process. So they began in 2019 with a stakeholder workshop where they invited, actually there was a call inviting everyone from the public to NGOs, to local communities, to scientists to contribute any kind of bioenergy relevant project proposals. And we looked at all those proposals that were submitted as part of this call, and we found a relatively even share, as you see on the right side, between the three perspectives. There are some that couldn't be attributed to any of the three perspectives. There are some that address sort of public transportation or education that didn't sort of fit into the framing of the three visions. But there's a relatively even share between the three different visions. And the way the process works is the future agency looks at sort of the project proposals and attributes these stars to the different proposals. And the first star just sort of attributes that it's a substantial project idea, but the projects can be sort of at an idea stage. They don't have to be sort of fully worked out. Then a second star is given to the projects when there's a very specific project outline, which is sort of ready for application and worthy of funding. So it has to have a detailed finance plan and milestones for the project. And the third star is then giving to sort of projects that have been identified to be eligible for funding and are essentially ready for a final decision by the authorities, and so these project proposals that have the third star are then sort of handed over to the ministry that then decides whether the projects are funded or not. And here is an overview of how the share of the different perspectives actually changes throughout this process. And what we see here is, as we move from left to right, that we see a pretty strongly increasing focus again on biotechnology focused projects. And the reason for this is, or can very well be, that the decision makers are again experts that usually pursue this this biotechnology perspective of the bioeconomy. But this creates two main challenges that we see. One is that there's an increasing gap for the satisfaction of a lot of the stakeholders that aren't considered sufficiently. And we have seen in the past that this can create strong problems in a transformation process. We have often seen how the general public has sort of blocked certain projects in the Energiewende if they didn't feel sufficiently if their perspective wasn't sufficiently considered. So again, we've heard a lot of feedback from the public and also NGOs that their perspectives and their projects and their focus on ecological perspectives wasn't sufficiently considered. So this is one of the challenges that comes from this. And the second one is that that we may, through this focus, actually create new secondary sort of problems when we're trying to solve one problem with this rather exclusive focus on technological progress without sort of an equal consideration of the sustainability and the ecological perspectives of this process. So then we looked at the rules, and I'm going to just go quickly through this. But we looked at sort of the different types of rules, how this implementation takes place. So we have boundary rules that sort of assures the entrance and the participation in the process, so the stakeholder involvement. We have an aggregation set of rules that sort of look at and define how decisions are made in the process. Then we have information rules. So how is information made available? And then the question of scope. So what is the level of freedom in discussing and sort of deciding? So this addresses more the results and the outcomes of the process. And what we see for the transformation process in the coal mining region is that the influence, so the final influence of deciding what projects are funded and what is implemented is very disproportionately weighed. That there's, for example, no representation of the civil society in the future agency. And we've also seen that there's some intransparency with respect to the decision criteria. So it wasn't initially clear what exactly the decision criteria were, based on which funding for a certain project was decided. And this gives us quite some work to do for future research, because when we look at the way a lot of the projects are currently sort of assessed, we see that, for example, a lot of life cycle assessments are done for certain technologies and processes, but they're rarely ever actually compared with each other. So we have no full understanding yet from a sustainability assessment perspective of how the biomass is actually best used. What is the optimal use of the biomass? Where is the sustainability impact greatest? And we also don't have sufficient understanding of what the best compromise is to satisfy all the stakeholders. And so what we're currently developing in our research is actually a research approach where we develop transformation pathways, a little similar to the shared socioeconomic pathways that we want to analyze together with the stakeholders in a multi-criteria, multi-stakeholder decision analysis approach, so that we can use the stakeholder workshops actually to look and sort of discuss with the stakeholders from a sustainability assessment perspective what the best options are. And so coming to the conclusions, so we see and believe that integrating the stakeholder perceptions in the societal transformation processes is crucial. The multi-stakeholder, multi-criteria decision analysis approach allows for considering also the subjective weights and decision criteria of the stakeholders. Ranking alternatives from a multi-criteria sustainability perspective can support a transparent decision-making process, which is currently often criticized. And we believe that this will also foster sort of a mutual understanding between the stakeholders and can thus help to achieve a societal consensus that sort of supports the transformation process. And with this, I would like to stop. I would like to thank the Ministry of Culture and Science that is funding this research, and also my colleagues and the team that work with me on the topic. And I look forward to the questions now.
Yeah, and so I just want to encourage questions in the chat box. We don't have too much time, unfortunately. I'm going to jump in, but do keep an eye on the chat box as well. So add those to the chat box. In the meantime, I just wanted to make the relation back to Sally Benson's talk, where she was talking about preferences and how important preferences are. So I thought the rich research that you've done has really brought out a lot of these questions in a really meaningful way. Just a quick question, and we'll probably go on to the next speaker for the interest of time, but please do stay on because there might be more integrative questions at the end if we have time, and I'm sure into the break as well. And before we, the Edeltraut Gunther has that systematic review of bioenergy, which might be interesting to you, a bioenergy LCA, so that might be interesting. But in terms of eco concerns not being prevalent in some of the survey data that you were looking at, I thought that was such an interesting finding because, of course, you know, bioenergy systems can be in part viewed as ecosystems themselves. So I'm wondering if that could, on the one hand, be a more general concern, or if you have any insight as to why exactly that would be the case.
Yeah, so I guess there are two things. One, I think many believe that it is sort of implicit. So when we're talking about the bioeconomy, we're always talking about the sustainable bioeconomy. So some of the articles may not explicitly discuss it, but still have it sort of as the general underlying part of the concept itself. So that could be one argument. And another argument that we have found and that we see sort of as also as our objective for future research is that there's a lot of sustainability assessment on sort of looking at available biomass actually sort of bio waste available for uses. But there's very little, which I believe is really important for a true sustainability assessment, to look at, we can only use the biomass once, right? It seems to me that now everyone looks at the stock of biomass that we have for this use, but everyone wants to use it for pharmaceuticals, for bioplastic, for biofuels, for bioenergy, and everyone looks at sort of the same amount of biomass. But I think what we really need is sort of an optimized, sort of similar optimized understanding of where do we best use the biomass that we have, because it can really only be used once. And yeah, so I think that's one important sustainability aspect to consider.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandra. Lovely to see you again. Please do keep an eye on the chat. I see there's one in there, but we are quickly running out of time because there's so many wonderful things to talk about. Now, interestingly, I think having Karush follow up at this point. Sandra, would you mind unsharing? I think sometimes that can be a bit of a trick, a challenge when someone new wants to share the screen, so we can open up to
Okay.